Good morning. Continuing our journey in Hemshech Samach Vav. We're on page 29 in the new edition and discussing the Chol Tichlo Re'isi Kates. That overall, that means for every end there's a beginning. Referring to, as the Rebbe Rashab said, Yesh Leimer, the Seder Hishtalshlus. This is referring to the entire cosmic order. All of existence is defined by this short verse that it's all finite, structured, parameters, midah, v'shir, and breaking it down, says what are the fundamental elements or ingredients that make up existence? Oiris and kalim, energies and containers. Everything consists of those two elements. And both of them are gvul. He began with the containers, kalim, even the kalim of Atzilus, which are divine, but that's what they are. Containers creates measure, contains boundaries, and thus an infrastructure. And the same with the Oidus. The Oidus, well, let me just go back to the Kalim. So even though it's true that, like I said, the Kalim, from there they extend, they shape and form the lower worlds of Bri, Yetzirah, Asiyah. Means the Kalim go further than Atzilus. So they manifest more than just in their own domain. But he said, nevertheless, it's subject to hierarchy, because there's Pnimius HaKelim that goes into Bria, the Pnimius of the Chitzenius, there's Emtsoim that go into Yetzirah. And in general, there's a Shir Amida, like he called it, Shir Kemish Al Yetzer Bereshis. And the words of the Avedis HaKodesh, that just as God has the power of the infinite, he has the power of the finite, and the first state of the finite are the Kalim of Atzilus. Kalim, that's what he says. They are the Kalim. Kalim of Esesrius of Atzilus. Now let's talk about the Oidus. Because you could say, okay, the structure, the finite nature is defined by the containers. Just like, let's say, we say letters on a page. The letters are the Kalim, that channel, the ideas that you're conveying. Whereas the ideas themselves, you could argue, maybe don't have that finite nature. And the answer is that's incorrect. The Oidus also have finite nature. The Oidus that enter the Kalim, as we see it, well, in human terms, for sure we see it. Because not just the letters on the page, or the words I'm using now as I communicate, but also the ideas that are being conveyed. You can call it the energy, the Oid within it is also tailored and structured. But the same thing is Lamailo. So he says that also the Oidus, and let's sum up what he said about that. It begins with a kav, where the Oidus of Seder Shtalshus, the energy within the cosmic order, originate from. So there's one main artery. And I've used many names for it. Kav chut literally is the words of the Arizal, means a line and a thread. Referring to the line and thread of light, like a laser beam, as opposed to the Igul HaGadol, as opposed to an all-encompassing and all-pervasive divine consciousness that doesn't have any parameters. So the Kav, by definition, is, and that's the artery that brings all air, and the Kav, as he says, like it says in Torah Air, it's Hamshacha that is Gvul Amida. The Kav is Air. It's not just the container, it's not just let's call it the light bulbs and the appliances, it's the actual energy flow, the electricity that flows into Seder Shtalshlus. The Cholin Yonei, and the entire function, a purpose, and significant and role of the Kav is Lases Mailo Mata, is to create hierarchy, is to create a structure where there's something that's a higher level on a lower level, like it says in Eitz Chaim. That which is on a higher level means there's more ribui oir, more intense, more energy, and a more revealed way. That's what defines a higher level. What defines a lower level with is lesser intensity, less oir, and less revelation. And then he went on to explain it, actually start going into Seder Shtalshus, the structure. Began first the difference between the revelation of energies in the worlds higher than Atzilus compared to Atzilus. One of the worlds higher than Atzilus is Parsuf of Ak, Adam Kadmon. We're reviewing what we learned yesterday, the previous 2 days ago. Yesterday, previous class. Parsuf of Ak. There, the Eir HaKav radiates begilui mamish. So the Kav, the first structure created by the Kav, by this artery, by this, I call it a paintbrush, laser beam, they're all good analogies, is the world of Adam Kadmon, and therefore there's a lot of intense light there. Think of it as the, I don't want to use physical terms, but like the closest planet to the sun. But here it's like the first entity that the Kav creates. So the Kav is Begili Mamish, to the point that all the levels in Ak, even though there are levels, they're all his scholars, they're all interconnected as one. So even though Ak can gaze, like we said, it's a snapshot, it's a look, a bird's eye view of all of existence, save kol adeiros till the end of time, end of all generations. Nevertheless, it's all in one snapshot, one skira achas, one gaze, one picture. Scholars to the point that it's like one entity. Why is it one entity when it has so many details, like we spoke about? Because the intensity of the oir is so strong, it overshadows the detailed structure that will emerge once the oir recedes and becomes more diminished. That's Ak. Because Eir Ein Sof Mamish is radiating there through the Kav. So it has that strongest power. As the light will become more diminished and the kalim will become more developed, obviously the defined structures and parameters will emerge in direct proportion to that. Then there's something even higher. To go over, he says, there's the Reishis HaKav. Before Ak is created, the very Kav itself, that very flow of energy, that very artery, as it begins, is called Reishis HaKav, the head, or the top of the Kav, meaning the moment it leaves its source, so it's right at at its point of departure. So he says that Gili is even higher than Ak. And he brings for this from the Eitz Chaim that says that above Gulgalta, above the skull of Adam Kadmon, there's a level that's Kedugmas Atik. Shalamayla Gulgalta Da'ak. That means that level is even higher, Nivdil Be'erech, even from Adam Kadmon. So that's where we stopped. So what he's showing here is demonstrating how even in the Oyer, this structure, and the Oyer, based on the measure and the intensity and its state of revelation, that determines higher and lower levels, bottom line, spiritual higher and lower levels. But he's now going to spell it out even further with more of the levels of Seder Shtalshlus, all to make the case that the entire cosmic order, Kalim and Oyer, all are midah v'gvul. Chol tichla re'isi kates. So let's continue, like 2/3 of the way down on page 29, where he's continuing to lay out the map of Seder Shtalshlus. Not every detail, not every level, but a few to give us a good sense of this structure. So the line that begins, the Hainu Shenivdel Be'erech Gam B'chinas Ak, it's 3, 6, 9 lines from the bottom of page 29, the new edition. You want to follow the text, you go to samachvav.com, where all these pages have been scanned as PDFs. You can print them out, you can read them on your phone, you can, as I've said many times, even if you don't want to follow the text, I'll be reading it and explaining it, so not absolute necessity. So it continues like this. Omnom, now, further, however, gam b'chinas ak meir gili ein sof mamish. So even though the Reishis HaKav is at higher level than Ak itself, it's like Gedugmas Atik, but Ak is no slouch either. Like we said, Ak radiates in Ak ein sof mamish. When I says mamish, we've explained many times, mamish comes to distinguish it from saying Ein Sof. You don't say mamish. It's Eir Ein Sof, but not in full glory, the full intensity of it. So Ak, lower than the Reish Sakav, but higher than Atzilus. But he's going to go here even higher than another level that comes after Ak. And he's introducing us to a level called Akudim. So he says, Eir Ein Sof Mamash, Uba Akudim Eina Gilui Kolkach. What comes after Adam Kadmon? So again, there's the Tzimtzum, space, the Reish Sakav, the artery, the laser beam begins to flow. All this again, conceptual, not physical. Ak is the first all-encompassing structure I call Kloli, like the snapshot of the entire Seder Shtalshlus. Then comes the next level, is called Akudim. So before we continue, let me just spell it out so you understand the map. Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim are three levels that we're going to be discussing now that are based actually in a verse, interestingly, in Parsha Vayetze. The Parsha where Yaakov is tending to the sheep of Laban, of Lavan, his father-in-law. So we know Yaakov worked there, spent 20 years, and his primary work was being a shepherd. He worked 7 years, and he got Leah, then 7 years for Rachel. So, an interesting narrative, the Torah elaborates about this tending of sheep. Not just that he tended sheep, how he bred them. He used the maklis, he used these different color rods to breed them, so they should breed in different ways with different shapes and different spots or stripes. It's a whole discussion, which seems a little odd. Why do we need to know what kind of sheep he bred? You could say he was a shepherd, and he was very successful, and he made his father-in-law wealthy, and he himself benefited from it, and that's that. Comes the Arizal in Eitz Chaim, a very interesting Eitz Chaim, and says, these sheep, yes, they're physical sheep on earth, but they represent spiritual levels. Like everything in the Torah is medaberes bel yenim u'ramezes betachtenim. Everything in the Torah is really talking about spiritual cosmic archetypes and levels that when they manifest in this world, they take on the shape of whether it's fire or water or sheep. So everything in this world has its spiritual counterpart. What's the counterpart of these sheep? So he actually defines the verse in a very unique and original way. He says, the Lavan. Lavan is the name of Yaakov's future father-in-law, the father of Leah and Rachel, who was a mischievous, sly criminal, basically, as the Torah tells us, a deceiver. But Lavan too has a sheirish lemaila. And it's interesting, the name Lavan also means white. Lavan comes from the color white. It has other meanings. So says the Arizal, what's the sheirish of Lavan? Is the pure whiteness of Ein Sof, of Keser. And the Lavan Hoyutzein, I think it says Ein Sof, Levin Ha'elyon is the expression. The supernal whiteness, the pure whiteness of the highest levels of Elikus. And this Lavan Hoyutzein, that from that whiteness of Ein Sof emerged three types of sheep. And that's where the words come from, Akudim, Nekudim, and Vrudim. There are three types of sheep. And Arizal explains there are three levels in the worlds. Akudim was a sheep that had one spot. Nekudim was stripes. And Vrudim was many spots. There's different interpretations how we understand that. Bottom line is, what is that in spiritual worlds? That after the world of Adam Kadmon, Ak, comes a world that is called Akudim, which also means bound. Akud. 10 energies, says the Arizal, in one keli. Eser eres b'klei echad. Akud b'klei echad. So now in Ak, we spoke about it's all concentrated like in a seed or in a one cell. Everything's concentrated. In Akudim, one level lower than Ak, now the energies are beginning to emerge. But it's still only one keli. The keli is still one, and 10 energies bound. So the word Akudim means to be bound in one keli. Then will come Nekudim, comes from the word Nekudis, points. Here we'll have 10 energies and 10 containers, but they're still not balanced. They're not harmonious. So the energies are very intense, the kelim are very fragile. This will ultimately cause shviras hakelim. Nekudim is the world of Tohu. There'll be a shattering, a dissonance due to the disparity between Oir and Keli. And then will come Vrudim. Vrudim is another name for the world of Olam HaTikun or for Olam Atzilus. It's all synonymous. Vrudim, Tikun, Atzilus. And this will take the 10 energies and the 10 containers and will create a balanced harmony where there's the energies fit into the containers, there's no dissonance, there's no disparity, there's no imbalance. So Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim, 3 stages of development after Adam Kadmon, 10 energies in one container, 10 energies and 10 containers, but there's not balanced yet. It's chaotic. And then 10 energies that settle into 10 kelim. And based on this formula that we've discussed, that it all depends on the intensity of the kav, of the oir. So in Ak, it's Eir Ein Sof Mamish, so that's why everything is all hiskalus. It's all concentrated in one snapshot. In Akudim, is one level lower, it's going to be 10 energies. So it's still quite intense, but it's already broken into 10 energies and one container. In Nekudim, even more breaking down, and Vrudim even more so. So this is all part of understanding how Oir is midah v'gvul, that Oir creates structure. That's the whole purpose of this Oir, is to literally create the parameters and of time and space, actually, spiritual time and space, conceptual time and space, Milo Mata, as he said earlier. So now let's read it inside. So here's what he says. So even though the Reishis Akav, of course, is higher than Ak, but Ak is still, Ak is still Meir Gili Ein Sof Mamish. Uba Akudim Eina Gili Kol Kach. In Akudim, the Gili, the revelation is not as strong or intense as it is in Ak. Ad, to the point, Shesham Yeshis Chalkus Esredes. In Akudim, now you have a breakdown of 10 energies. And you'll see in the footnotes, he brings the Eitz Chaim. Everything I summed up is from these sources that you can follow up if you want in the footnotes here. So now there's 10 Eidos. In Ak, we said it was all Iskalus, one picture. Now it's Eser Eidos. And also, V'gam Nizgalasham B'chinas HaKelim. And in Akudim, another thing, the Kelim are beginning to emerge. In Ak, you don't really see Kelim yet. Here, in Nizgala, still one Keli, but it's a Keli. Like he writes in the Eitz Chaim again is the classic work of the Arizal, who did not write his own teachings. Chaim Vital, that's why it's called Eitz Chaim. Many of the books are called by the name Chaim, pre-Eitz Chaim, and so on. Eitzus Chaim, Eitz Chaim. So there he writes, the Tchilas is Galus HaKelim Hu Ba'Akudim. The beginning of the emergence of containers is in the world of Akudim. So here you see a process. And again, one of the best examples I find to visualize this is the development of a fetus from the moment of conception to the moment of birth. 9 months, at the gestation period, it's exactly what's happening. We literally have something we can visualize, we can identify with. It begins one cell, all concentrated. The cell will then break, split into 2, then into 4, into 8, and 16, 32, 64, 128, etc., till an average human being has between 35 and 75 trillion cells. All began with one. Because the creation of a human being, the formation, the development of a human being, for that matter also animals, as well as trees and vegetation, mirror the way God created existence. It begins with one achdus that will then branch into details. It all begins with the oneness. The higher the level of energy, the more you're in touch with the unity, like an Ak, or even higher, Reishis Sarkav. As it travels, as the Ur travels, the Ur becomes less intense, and therefore it breaks into 10 energies in Akudim, and a Keli emerges. As it continues, this will continue to branch off and direct proportion to the intensity of the energy and to its revelation, as we've been discussing. So that is the world of Akudim. Biyadua, this galus hakelim huaydeit simtsum ha'er v'heder agilu shalei. And now he's spelling it out. What's the connection? Because the emergence of the containers is in direct proportion and a result of the tzimtzum ha'er, of the diminishment of the light, and the heder agilui, and we'll say the lesser flow of revelation. In other words, when the light is shining in the strongest way, it doesn't allow for the keli to emerge. An example, go back to a simple example, you'll see a speaker or a writer who they're brilliant and they have tremendous ideas. You'll often see, if they're not disciplined, they start saying things that are completely overwhelming. The audience, the crowd will not understand what they're talking about. They get so excited because there's so much and so little kelim. A good speaker needs to channel and harness the ideas, into the right words so people can listen to. You also have the other extreme, obviously. You could have someone who has a lot to say with not a lot of words and they're not saying much. But here we're talking about the example, there's a lot of so you need simtsum and heder agili. There needs to be restraint and refrain in the flow of any in order to manifest within kelim and to be able to be transmitted properly. Same thing in electricity. If you didn't have circuit breakers and so on and regulators, electricity would run into an appliance, and if there's a surge, it would blow all the circuits. Perfect example of a not allowing the container, or actually even overwhelming the container. I mean, these are all obviously physical examples that we can relate to, but the concept is similar. Here it's on spiritual levels. But it's a very, if you think about it, very eloquent structure, everything dependent on the balance of how much and how much keli. And this is all engaged and interactive. So that's what he's saying. So that's why the kelim start emerging, the keli starts emerging in Akudim, because the energy has been diminished a bit compared to Ak. Now, Akudim is not where it stops. The journey continues. So now he's going to the next level. Umakol mokim, and nevertheless, Akudim gam kemer gili erein sof. Don't make Akudim is not a low level. Akudim is still quite a high level, and there are two erein sof radiates. He doesn't say erein sof mamish now, if you notice, but it's still erein sof is radiating, obviously in a more diminished way compared to higher levels, but compared to lower levels, Akudim is still only has one keli. You don't have yet a full structure. Ad sha'eser eris hin akudim v'klulim b'klei echad. To the extent, like we said earlier, that the 10 energies are akudim, they're bound, and klulim, all encompassed it in one keli. Again, the footnotes give you more the sources for this. V'achar kach, what comes next? Achkach bizgalus esesphirs de nekudim. And then, with the emergence of the next stage, of the 10 spheres in the world of Nekudim, not Akudim, Nekudim, the points. Even though we know they have intense light, that's why it shatters the containers. The Nekudim, now it's 10 energies in 10 containers, not in one container, it's in 10 containers. And then finally, we'll see how far he goes. Then comes the next world. It's called Vrudim in some places. The third stage of what I said before, the 3 levels of the sheep. It also has the name Tikkun and the name Atzilus. Now he goes, Ubefrad b'Tikkun. And then specifically, when you go to the world of Tikkun, which is the level after Nekudim, Now things are beginning to become much more settled. The oir is much more miyut, has been diminished even more than in the Nekudim, which is already diminished compared to Akudim, which is diminished compared to Ak, which is diminished compared to Reshis Akav. Just to go back all the levels we've been discussing. But now you also have miyut ha'er v'ribui hakelim. The oir is more diminished, and the kelim have now proliferated and become much more mature, not as fragile as they are. In Toyu or in the Kudim, the expression is, it says, Oiris merubim v'kelim mu'atim. Doesn't bring that right here. Intense energies and minimal containers. Sometimes the containers, like they're more fragile. And now it's kelim ribuya kelim. Again, thinking of the fetus, development of a fetus, what happens in the second trimester and the third? Now the body, the limbs and organs begin to take shape and form, whereas earlier it's all concentrated, and there now a structure is beginning to emerge. And indeed, the oir is also becoming less. That's why it can develop and emerge that way. And this will continue through the pregnancy and at birth. I didn't know to the extent, but I remember once at a conference hearing from an expert on this, that we lose millions and millions, maybe even billions, he may have said, cells when the child is born. Because for the child to be able to emerge from the birth canal and then be on its own, it's too intense what it has within pregnancy. So bottom line is, the oirs become diminished, the kelim become stronger, until the point they can work together in a balanced, healthy, harmonious fashion. Ukiyadua, the ikra kelim hu ba'atzilus, as it's known, the primary containers are in Atzilus. They began to be formed in Akudim, and further in Nekudim. But in Atzilus, that's where the primary kelim are. V'ashem zeh nikra Asiyah deklolos. Remember, we spoke microcosm, macrocosm. That's why Atzilus goes into the macrocosm of Asiyah. Why Asiyah? Because Asiyah tells you it's a finished product. Bria Yetzirah is still, Bria is a entity without shape. Yetzirah has already shape. But Asiyah is a full-blown entity, because in Atzilus, the Ribi HaKelim give it a full structure. So on the macrocosm, where Bria, the klolos of macrocosm would be Ak, Atzilus, the klolos would be Lifnei HaTzimtzum, or maybe Reshis Akav even. Yetzirah, the klolos would be Akudim and Nekudim, according to one explanation. Atzilus is now Asiyah, the klolos. Atzilus, the protis, the microcosm is Asiyah, the klolos, because here the kelim have taken on full shape. So this lays out how the oiris, not just the kelim, have a hierarchy and define hierarchy. They create the structure and the parameters of all the levels of Seder Ishtalshlus. But now he's going to come further and break it down into the very microcosm of Atzilus itself. But let me stop here if anyone has any questions on what we've just learned. And then he's going to continue to still develop this L'chol Tichler Re'isi Kates, the defined and finite structure of existence, both in the Kelim and the Oiris. Any questions? Okay. Just for the record, I saw that the map was posted on the group as someone noted there were discrepancies there, so I don't know if you can rely on it too much, to be honest. There, Akudim was put all the way on top and Ak is lower. It's not, to me, an accurate map. I mean, some things are accurate, obviously, but it's. I'll see if I can find something that really pictures here. What he just said here, you see clearly Ak, then Akudim. That was one, but there was a few other things that looked to me a little off. So I wouldn't just rely on it as an authoritative, definitive picture. Not sure who made it or what it's based on, but just wanted to point that out. But it's good to be able to get a snapshot of this whole picture here, this map. Okay, so let's continue. So with 2 lines from the bottom, Now he says further, v'chein ba'atzilus b'proteaspheres. Till now, we've been talking about all these worlds, these dimensions. The top of the kav, Reshis HaKav, Akudim, Nekudim, Atzilus, Tikkun. But now, when you go, let's put a microscope on Atzilus itself, you have proteaspheres. Atzilus is made up of a structure too, within Atzilus itself, of 10 spheres. 10 spheres, which are also made up of Eris and Kalim. So in addition to the general picture of Eris and Kalim, Atzilus itself is made up of 10 spheres. Kamoi b'chochma meir, gili ein sof yesem b'spheres habina. So here too there's a hierarchy and a structure. In Chachma radiates more ein sof than in Bina. Just as we spoke earlier that in Ak radiates more than Nekudim, and in Akudim more than Nekudim, etc., in Atzilus itself, the flow continues. So in the specific spheres, Chachma is a higher level than Bina. Why? Because there's more Ur. As we said, it's not just higher by accident, it's because there's more divine energy. And it quotes yet another Eitz Chaim, the Bekeser v'Chachma meir ein sof b'kiruv mokim. So there he uses an analogy of space. That when you have a light shining, think of the sun. So whatever's closer to the sun has more intense light. Or a big torch. Closer to the torch, the light is shining. B'kiruv mokim. So he says these words. In Keser and Chachma, Ein Sof radiates b'kiruv mokim, like it's very close. Ein Sof, of course, is higher, but Keser and Chachma are close by. Here, of course, means conceptually close by. So it's kiruv mokim. Ubabina, next page, the language of the Arizal is berichuk mokim, from a distance. So it's inevitable for us to use that we won't use physical imagery, but it's exactly that. Chachma is close to the source. Bina is a step away. But again, this is all conceptual, not physical. Oh, he says that actually explicitly. We're back on page 30. We turned the page. V'yadua. I'm glad the Rebbe Rashab says it. The Eina Kavana Mokim Mamish Chaz v'Shalom. That when the Eitz Chaim says Mokim, Kiruv Mokim, Richuk Mokim, closer, a closer space, closer proximity, and more distant proximity, doesn't mean, God forbid, actual space. It means conceptually and qualitatively that a Chachma radiates an Eir with more Ribui and Gili. So Chachma and Bina could be physically right near each other, but one is receiving a lot more Eir and Gili. As is discussed at length in the Maimer, the Drush, the discourse of the Rebbe Marash, the father of the Rebbe Rashab, called the Kocha HaGodl. I'll explain in a minute why. In the year Tov Reish Lamed Zayin, which would be the equivalent of 1877. Yeah. So, briefly, V'kocha is one of the classic discourses. It's one of the first Hamsheichim that we have in Chassidus. The Rebbe Marash, as I've noted in the past, was the first one that wrote a Hemshech of Maimorim, which means not just one discourse, but a series. Samach Vav and Ayin Beis are massive Hemsheichim. The Kocha is called Kocha HaGodl because it was a long Hemshech of, if I recall, it's at least maybe 150 pages, 120 pages. I don't remember exactly. But it was considered a Kocha HaGodl. Now, obviously there's Maimorim called V'kocha, but there are individual Maimorim. So that's what the name that it was given, V'kocha HaGodl, and it's from the year Tov Reish Lamed Zayin. That's Reish Lamed Zayin. Like Reish Samach Vav, this is Reish Lamed Zayin. This would be 30 years, 29 years before Samach Vav was delivered. But this is still the time of the Rebbe Marash. As we know, the Rebbe Marash passed away in Tov Reish Mem Gimel, 1883. Or I should say 1882 to be exact. because it was before the new English year. It was Yud Gimel Tishrei that year, right before Sukkot. Okay, so that he elaborates at length, and again the footnote. Let me see. Footnote 60 tells you it's in chapter 29 and on. But the bottom line is now that in Atzilus itself, using the same principle and formula, the light is greater, the energy is greater in Chachma, and that's what makes Chachma higher than Bina. And Mokim here means conceptual space. So it's like you would say, this person is a greater Talmid Chacham than someone else, a greater scholar and is a lesser scholar. It doesn't mean greater as in taller or physical, it means more knowledge, more scholarship. The kol zeh, and all the above, is going back to the beginning point. How did all this structure come into play? Who defined it? So obviously it's the godly energy, but in what manner? What did God use, so to speak, to measure and create these parameters? So he says, "V'kol zeh nimded al yedei hakav." All this was measured and defined through the kav, that artery that I spoke about, that laser beam. Oir. Shemoided eifan hagili be'elemis ha'einsof u'be'elim ha'atzilus u'b'chol sfiras befrat. That measures, literally measures the flow of the manner of revelation in the Elemis Ein-Sof, which he's referring now as higher than Atzilus, is sometimes called Elemis Ein-Sof, and in Atzilus, Be'elim Atzilus, and in every detailed sphere, like we just discussed, Chachma Bina, and the same with the other spheres. Ukiyadua, and the Rebbe Rashab now elaborates even more to give us the anatomy, if you wish, dissecting the anatomy of the skeleton of the entire cosmic order. So he says, "Ukiyadua sheyesh kavin v'tzenedus miyuchadim l'chol svira b'frat," as it's known that there are tracks and tzenedus are channels specific in every sphere specifically. And again, a very simple example for this would be the human body. The human body, even though we're one entity, but you start breaking down, if you take an X-ray of the human body and you see, what do you see? You can have one main artery, you can have one spine, but then the spine branches off the whole nervous system. You can have main arteries coming out of the heart, and then they branch off into veins and capillaries and so on. So you see this everywhere. You see it in a tree. A tree begins with a seed, it grows, then it begins to branch. The roots begin to also develop. So it all is in a form of structure and very measured. So what's measuring all of this? What's defining all this structure? So he's now adding that it's known that in each sphere there are specific, what he calls is kavim and tzenedus, basically tracks and channels, branches, if you wish, just like a main river branching off into different parts. Shuzeu Amedida, and this is all based on the measurement. Like it is again back to the human body. These branches all help define each particular limb and organ and detail within the human body, within the organism, and the same in nature. And he's explained the same as Lamaila. God created it in a very structured way. So every sphere has an intricate and elaborate anatomy that when you begin to focus on it, breaks into all these different details, what he's calling covenant tzenedus. And again, the footnotes, feel free to check them out. They'll give you more information on any of these topics we're just reading here. So who measures all of this? That's the Kav. So if you think of God as a cosmic artist, the Kav is his paintbrush, which, if you look at a good paintbrush, has bristles, has small little pieces, parts, in order to create a beautiful painting. It's not just broad strokes. You need to have the intricate details. That's why you'll find a brush that has the brush itself splinters it down so the artist can control the exact amount of flow of ink that he's using to be able to draw the painting. So God similarly, it actually starts with God. That God, the cosmic artist, is using the kav to be the measuring rod, if you wish, the measuring flow of all the energy going through all the worlds and all the details, as we just described, and all as they branch off into every specific detail throughout all of existence. So that explains the general Iris and Kalim that he spoke about, but now he's going to talk about what comes next. We still stopped at Atzilus here. We didn't talk about Bria, Yitzira, Asiyah. So he's going to talk about that now, because what happens, does the Kav have a place where it stops? We discussed it the other day. Does the Kav continue to flow all the way to the bottom of existence, meaning to the lowest levels? So we're going to get to that next, but I'm going to stop again for any questions. All clear? Okay. It's quite poetic, quite articulate. The Rebbe Rashab really laying it out. Good. So let's continue. What happens next? So next, v'klolos hakav, v'klolos gili hakav, mistayim ba'atzilus. Now the kav does come to a point where it does stop. The general gili hakav ends in Atzilus. The footnote 62, again to Eitz Chaim. Now what does that mean that it ends? We understand all this is not physical. It means conceptually. The original kav and its original light stops at the end of Atzilus. But that doesn't mean the light doesn't continue to shine. The kav is still quite intense there. So it will give off reflections and reflections of reflections that will continue, like he's going to say now. So before I continue, let me just elaborate on one, just give a small introduction just to make it very clear, because we think in very spatial terms. So we think we have now figured it out, we have now the structure. Keep in mind that we're dealing here with Ein Sof. So this is not like in the physical world. For example, if you have water coming from a reservoir, and the reservoir is transmitting water through main water mains that go into the cities in which we live, and those water mains are major pipes, arteries, that then break down into smaller pipes, which break down even further into smaller pipes, and finally you have a main water line coming into your home, and that too still has to break down into pipes, the pipe structure within your home, and every sink and every water supply that you have is a very small channel compared to the larger main, So we can contain that because it's all ultimately finite and limited. And we can relate to it because we live in a world of gvul. But here's the thing. When you talk about Elikus, it is true God, like we said before, Yesh le'keiche b'gvul, he has the power to create such a gvul, but it's still Elikus. It's just Elikus as godliness is manifesting in structure. And that's the Eretz and Kalim we just elaborated upon. But you have to still always keep in mind that it is, even the Kav itself, even on the highest level, is still after the Tzimtzum. It itself also had to go through a Tzimtzum. So the Kav has many, many levels to it. And I'll give you the example of the sun. Someone were to ask you, how hot is the sun? How powerful is the sunlight? Answer is not so simple. If you go into the very core of the sun, it's one answer. Then when the sun begins to, you go more to the edges of the sun, the edges of the corona and so on, it becomes less. when the sunlight begins to emerge from the sun, it goes through many, many levels till it gets to Earth, hundreds of thousands of miles away. Well, how many? I don't even know how far it is. More than hundreds of thousands. It's millions of miles. So you can imagine how much more so when you're talking about the Kav, that the Kav itself is also, is it a reflection? Is it the core?
It's 93 million.
And how much?
The sun is 93 million miles away from the Earth.
Yeah, right. That's right. 93 million. That's quite far. And yet it reaches here and it warms this earth and it illuminates this earth. So imagine how much more time is going that when you're talking about the light coming from Ein Sof, all the way from the Etzem, from the source, goes through tremendous amount of gradations. So he's now going to break it down even further in explaining when we say the Kav concludes at the end of Atzilus, what does that mean exactly? And what does it mean? What happens afterwards? So I just wanted to make sure that we understand that the Kav itself is not just a black and white thing. There's a Kav in Ein Sof Mamish in Ak and then Akudim. It's constantly going through many levels and has many levels within it that we don't even spell out. There's so many levels. So he says like this, V'yadua, it's known, the Gili Akav Shebetzilus, who gamkein ha'aretz Akav levad. Even the Gili Akav and Atzilus is a reflection of the Kav. What does that mean? He just said the Kav ends in Atzilus. So let's read, be patient, and we'll see how he explains it. The Etzem HaKav hu meir rak ba'elam Ein Sof. The very core of the Kav, which means the very, if you were able to, let's take electricity. You know, electricity that runs into your appliances is very diminished. Even though it's true, God forbid, if somebody touches a live electric circuit, they'll get a shock. But it's not like touching a main artery, where there, God forbid, a person can get electrocuted. Why? Because it gets diminished as it continues to branch off. So here too, so though the Kav does flow into Atzilus, but compared to where the Kav is higher than Atzilus is like the very main line, what he calls Etzem HaKav. And Atzilus is Ha'aretz HaKav. Ha'ara doesn't mean a reflection from a distance. It just means, compared to the intensity of the Etzem HaKav, it's one wire of many wires. Let me put it that way. Whereas higher than Atzilus and Elam Ein Sof, he says, is Etzem HaKav. Shalif Atzilus, Etzem HaKav. Atzilus meir rak ha'aretz HaKav. So it's still the Kav, but compared to higher levels, it's called ha'aretz HaKav and not Etzem HaKav. And this is what he means. V'ha'aretz zu, and this wire, I'm using that simply to make it a little more palpable. This wire that is in Atzilus, that mistayemes b'bchinas malchus d'Atzilus. That wire ends, that energy flow ends in malchus of Atzilus. But we know that the Kav continues to affect because we have to create Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah. This world exists. It has to be created by the same and Kav. So how does that work? So he continues. So now he says, Umasha Kav Boka HaParsa. Then the Kav, there's a Parsa, as we've learned, a partition between Atzilus and Biyah. So the Kav, the very wire, one wire, not Etzem HaKav, or Ha'aretz HaKav, concludes in Malchus. And then when the Kav pierces, the Kav penetrates and pierces the partition, meaning it doesn't remain completely removed. When it pierces the Parsa, Umashakav Boka Parsa Imohem, and that's an expression in Tanya Negeres HaKedesh. Umeir Bahem Ba'atzilus Kamei B'biyah. 1 minute, 1 second. So down in the footnote, they say it should say Umeir behem b'biyah kamei ba'atzilus, because it doesn't make sense. What means Meir behem ba'atzilus kamei b'biyah? Even though you could force it by saying that the way it radiates in Atzilus is radiating in biyah. But in the footnote, if you look, they remark on footnote 65. So bottom line is like this, that the wire that we talked about, the electric live wire of the kav is not Atzilus. It stops there, but its effect continues. It's not like just an example, let's say the electricity running into your light bulbs. The light bulbs don't just illuminate where the light bulb is, it illuminates your entire room. So the light of the light bulbs, energized by the electricity that's flowing, extends outside of the very appliance. Same thing here, just as an example, that the ha'aras hakav stops in Atzilus, then there's a partition that allows for the creation of bria, biyah, and now the kav pierces that partition, meaning the light of the kav pierces that partition, so the kav itself doesn't continue. However, its light that it gives off does, and irradiates in biyah like an Atzilus. Not quite obviously with the same intensity, but it's coming from there. Hainu bekalim the malchus the Atzilus, which means the kalim of malchus of Atzilus, the lowest level of Atzilus, like we learned before that the Naran, the 30 kalim of malchus of Atzilus radiate in Naran, nefesh ruach neshama biyah, avaloi biyah atzman. Let me read that again to make sure we got it clear. Umashakav boka parsimon. And when we say the kav pierces the partition, and meir and biyah like an Atzilus, it's referring to malchus, the kalim of malchus Atzilus, will not be biyah itself. So basically he's saying that there is the next stage, you will get a reflection of a reflection, but not the kav itself in biyah. That's in simple words what he's saying here. But he's going to continue to explain this now in more Kabbalistic terms from Eitz Chaim, with the punchline being that the energy continues to flow, but it continues to get more and more diminished. Now we're not dealing with the kav itself anymore. We're now dealing with an effect of the kav. You can think of it like an echo effect or a reflection of. So it continues with the same pattern and formula that we discussed earlier, that the hierarchy and structure of existence, why is Bria not Atzilus? Why is Yitzira not Bria? Why is Asiyah not Yitzira? Because the air continues to get diminished and the Kalim continue to develop and become more powerful. All the way in this world, we'll soon learn and we'll discuss how the Kalim are most dominant here and the air is more concealed, in direct contrast as it is in the higher worlds. Just giving the context of what we're learning here. Let me stop if there are any questions. Let's do that first. Then we'll see if I'll continue here. No questions? Okay. So let's read a few more lines then. So continuing, he says like that. Okay. Hainu b'kelim malchus Atzilus. Now he's going to quote another Eitz Chaim and further elaborate and qualify this theme that we're discussing here of what happens after Atzilus in the lower worlds. So he says like this: V'gam hakav atzmai, and also the kav itself, the original kav. Hamislabzu b'chinas yesher da'ak, the language from Eitz Chaim that manifests in yesher of ak. If you remember, I mentioned yesher is another word for primi. and from Mamala Kalam. Makif, Seviv, and Igul, so Igulim and Yosher, Seviv and Mamala, Makif and Primi, these are all synonymous words, where Makif, Seviv, and Igulim, Seviv, and Makif are similar idea, and Yosher, Pnimi, and Mamala Kalaman are a similar idea. So what he's saying is that the Yosher of Ak, because Ak also have Igulim, there's also Makifim in Ak. Kav, however, is a Yosher, because Kav is a line. Kav is not an Igul. Igul, a circle, is more of a Makif, a more transcendent energy. The Kav is Pnimizdik energy. So he says the Kav that manifests within the Yosher, the Pnimius of Ak, Hamistayim Asiyah, which concludes in Asiyah. So let me explain what this means. Here I would like to use an image. I don't have a pen with me, so I'll just describe it. This is pretty critical in the whole picture, and I hope it doesn't confuse anyone. The Eitz Chaim, when it describes how the Kav creates existence, uses the following words. He says the Kav is a line, remember, like a paintbrush. But what does that line do? How does it create? So the words are, there's the Reishis HaKav, which we've learned about. That's the top of the Kav. What happens next? Before, how is Ak shaped? So the Eitz Chaim, the Arizal, actually spells it out in detail. He says this Kav is misagil. This one line creates a circle, a big circle. Then it continues and creates another circle. Concentric circles, 10 concentric circles. So these are the esespheres of Igulim, because they're circles, but they're created by the Kav. But the Kav continues. So if you had the imagery, it would look like this. It would look like an artery, like a line that creates a circle. The line continues, another circle, another circle, another circle. That's the Igulim of Ak. But because there's a line, there's also a structure. So think of if you were to look at it like a human structure, the structure is the Kav is creating the full structure of right, left, and center. Think of the Kav as like the spine, but there's a right and a left. And then there's Igulim that surround this structure that the Kav also created. That's the language of the Eitz Chaim. So that's how you have Makifim and Pnimim, Seva Mamala, Igulim, Yesher. So it's Yesher that's creating it all. It's the Kav. Now, how does a Kav create an Igul is a discussion of its own, is because the Kav is empowered by the Igul HaGadol, the big circle that was left after the Tzimtzum HaRishon that created a big space. So there's an outer circle above all of this, above the Kav. I hope you were able to follow what I just said. If you're familiar with this idea, obviously you'll get it. If not, I'll go over it again. Here I have no problem creating an image if you like, but that's, again, so a Tzimtzum creates an empty space. A Kav entered this space, a line. This line creates a circle, creates another circle, another circle. Meanwhile, the line continues its journey downward. After these circles, and the Kav continues, Ak is finished. Next world, Akudim. Same idea. Obviously, it gets more and more diminished, so the Kalim begin to emerge. The Eiras become more diminished, as we learned. In Atzilus, it's all a balance. Now, after Atzilus, what he's saying, so we'll soon get to after Atzilus. So the Eitz Chaim says, so if you think of it this way, the Igul that the Kav created, the first one, where's the bottom of that circle? It's all the way to the bottom of Ishtalshlus, because it's an Igul that encompasses the whole space where the Tzimtzum was created. So in essence, even though Ak is a higher level, but the Igulim of Ak, what he says here, the Kav that creates, that manifests in the Yesher of Ak, Mistayim Asiyah. So based on that, it would seem to appear that in Asiyah you have these highest levels. So he's going to qualify and say, so he says like this, Hari klolos b'chinas Ak. Nevertheless, the general level called Ak, that all-encompassing energy of Ak, Hagam shenimshach b'chol ha'elemus, even though, yes, it encompasses and is transmitted in all the worlds, Harihu muvdil mahem. It's separate from them. Ve'ena meir behem begili, and does not radiate them in a revealed way. So even though, yes, Ak, we learned earlier, is a snapshot, a bird's eye view of a whole Asiyah, including Asiyah. That's why its circle encompasses everything, but it's a circle. A circle is a makif, means it's not affecting it directly and it's not in a revealed way. So Asiyah is not benefiting from receiving any energy. The energy Asiyah receives is from the kav that gets more and more diminished. So even though Ak relates to Asiyah, just like having a bird's eye view, but it does not affect it. And that's why the ilmas are mitziyas yes, because if Asiyah was directly receiving from Ak, it would be a level like Ak, or at least a level close to Ak. And we clearly know that this world of Asiyah is a world of Yesh. The divine is not revealed in this world. As we learned, even lower levels than Ak don't have quite the intensity of Ak. So the fact that Ak encompasses it all doesn't mean it's revealed. And the revelation in each level of Ishtalshalus is not based on the Makif, it's based on the Yosher. It's not based on transcendent energies, it's based on immanent energies that enter into existence. It would be like saying the Etzem HaNefesh affects everything in your whole being. But Poel Mamish, you don't feel that effect. What you do feel is the energy that flows into your heart, into your mind, into your other limbs and organs. That's coming from the Giluyim of like the Kav, not coming from the Etzem HaNefesh. It all originates there, but Etzem HaNefesh is completely removed from your daily routines. What affects your daily routines is the flow of energy that enters your arms, your legs, the rest of your whole being. That's what he's essentially saying here. Now, this is advanced material, obviously, because it needs a lot of explanation. I'm explaining it based on having learned it many times, but it could be new for some of you. So in case this did throw you and it needs more explanation, by all means, I will explain it more. But I wanted to just, since he's saying it, I don't want to skip anything here. That's what he's saying right here. And that's why the Mitzvah say yesh, because if Ak was actually radiating in Asiyah, they wouldn't be capable of being self-contained ego or identity. It'd be in a state of complete nullification. So they have to say that the level of Ak, even though it extends, because it's like that bird's eye view, it's the overall energy of all of existence. You have to say it's separate from them. Means they don't relate to it, they don't connect with it. And therefore, even when we say kol kema, every structure, lefanecha tishtachave, prostrates itself, bows to you, in a state of utter nullification, Atzilus explains this is due to the bitl of Ak. And now he says, and maybe this is due to the igulim of Ak that we just discussed, the makifim of Ak. So even though there is that inner level of bittul, but it's not felt by the creations. And the bittul that they feel is only that which they choose through their own avodah. Like it says elsewhere. Move on. So what do we take away from all of this? The b'chinas hakav ein meir behem, that the kav is not radiating in them, because the kav has already concluded in Atzilus. V'rak ha'ora, v'ha'ora de ha'ora, only a reflection of a reflection. Ma'akav hu shemer b'biyah, is what radiates in biyah. So he covered all the bases here. That the bottom line is that oir creates hierarchy, structure. First we talked about the higher levels of the cosmic order. Now he's going into the lower levels. And so even though there is, in the makif level, there is a connection, but we don't feel it, and it's hidden from us because the oir is concealed. Both from the makif and also the primi of the kav doesn't radiate directly into the lower worlds, only a reflection of a reflection. The next paragraph will sum it up. It's not finished yet. I'm going to stop here. Any questions? I know I went a little longer than usual. I didn't want to stay in middle here. It would have left everything hanging. So I wanted to just finish the paragraph. Very quiet today, huh? Okay. So we'll continue the next class, and he's going to speak about the kav. At the end of the day, we see the kav. The bottom line, it's a finite entity that creates finite structure. And finite means levels and hierarchy and so on. That's going to be the summation of it, which goes back to L'chol Tichli Re'isi Kates. Every end has a beginning and end, the parameters of existence. And with that, we'll stop here. End of the paragraph.
I had a question.
End of the paragraph on page 30. Yes.
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, and I did come into the class late today, but we've learned in Iron Base that Malchus also plays a role in the diminishment of the ore as it moves from, let's say, Malchus of Atzilus to Malchus of Bria, Malchus of Yetzira, Chulu. And we also know that there's a parsa between Atzilus and Biyah. So to what extent does Malchus of Atzilus, um, how much of how much of it has the role of diminishing the light versus how much does the parsa have the role in diminishing the light?
Well, he's not talking about Malchus and the Par. He's talking here about the Kav. The Kav is the divine energy that measures everything. It measures Malchus, it measures the Parsa, it measures everything. So the Kav, as it flows, it uses the infrastructure as it sees necessary. It uses Chochmah and Bina and Malchus, and ultimately the Parsa, like we just learned about the Parsa, is a partition that is created after Atzilus, and the Kav pierces that partition. So these are all part of an infrastructure. It's like asking the question, what the role of the liver is and the lungs in context of the arteries that bring the blood to the entire body.
It's a whole system, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So the blood flow in this context is the kav. Those are the arteries coming, the artery and the arteries coming from bringing the life energy into the body. And then there's all kinds of different levels that help regulate it, help structure it, help filter, and so on. Okay. So we stop here, end of the paragraph, page 30.